Hi, this is Saintus and welcome back to Forge of Empires. And today I'm going to be looking at the ages in Forge of Empires from the colonial age all the way up to the contemporary era. Now, to start off with the colonial age, it is similar to the majority of the previous ages with a few notable exceptions. The first one is the size of the military buildings. As you can see, the musketeer and the ranger military buildings are both very narrow in just one direction, so you're going to have to change your city layout a little bit if you need those units. And also the grenadier, as you can see here, is this heavy unit. It finally gets range, so it alters the strategy in the battlefield a little bit. And finally, as for the great buildings, both the Deal Castle and this German name that I cannot pronounce, I do not recommend you for to build either of those great buildings. Now moving on to the industrial age. This one is a little bit different, but first I must mention that this great building over here, sorry, not a great building, the city hall is actually very good looking, one of my favorites of all the ages. But anyway, moving on to the important stuff. As you can see here, the continent of the industrial age is completely different. Basically, this little boat that you can see over here in the corner, you get access to it after conquering all of the provinces of the colonial age, and now you find yourself in North America. Essentially, the United States count as the main provinces, and Canada and Mexico just serve as bonuses. Anyway, the other main change over here, if you still use residential buildings, which is common in this age, is that buildings finally change from a standard 2x2, which used to be the norm in all the previous ages, and now it is a 3x2. So it forces you to change once again your city layout, and you'll see this over and over throughout the next ages. As for the military units, I must mention that the howitzer just is completely different from the grenadier in the previous age. Essentially, this now has a larger range, much larger range. It has much lower mobility, and it can also ignore stealth, which is a property that these Jaeger infantries, so this light unit over here, can conceal itself in the trees, and the howitzer can basically ignore that. Finally, as for the great buildings over here, the Royal Albert Hall is a fantastic great building, at least if you need the supply boost and also in a way the goods. But overall, if you're an advanced player, especially with the chateau early on, you don't really need the Royal Albert Hall, and the capital is a huge waste. Now moving on to the progressive era, I believe, yes. It also brings its own unique changes. The main one here, well, besides obviously residential buildings, they increase once more to a 3x3. I don't know if it shows here, but it's double lane roads. They change the paradigm essentially because now you have certain buildings that require doubling roads and others that don't. And this leads to the biggest change in your city layout, because not only are these good buildings going to require doubling roads, but also most importantly some of the military buildings that you definitely need to fight and to gain units from your Alcatraz. Those buildings require doubling roads, as you can see, the tank factory and the armored car. Now finally, as for the great buildings, both the Alcatraz and the Chateau are one of the absolute best great buildings in the game, no doubt about them. And I recommend you to build them as quickly as possible, and also for you to have an arc at level 80 and then upgrade them to a level as high as you can. Now moving on to the modern era once more, you'll find this meaningful change, which in this case we're talking about refined goods. Now refined goods is this concept they introduced to make the game more difficult, because they found out that players were producing huge amount of goods with pretty much no difficulty, and so they introduced this concept of refined goods. Now refined goods, essentially they just pick up a good from 3 ages before. So in this case, for the modern era, it is 1, 2, 3. It is from the colonial age, and basically need to spend those goods plus some coins and supplies in order to produce the final goods from the modern era. And not only that, they cannot be produced from your great buildings, which back in the day before event buildings, they used to be your main source of goods. Nowadays, these refined goods, that isn't much of a challenge for you. You can very easily go over it and just keep producing those refined goods with event buildings. It is as simple as that. And as for the grid buildings, I've discussed this before, the atomium is not worth it at all, and Space Needle is a complete waste as a grid building. Now moving on to the postmodern era. Now the main change of this age is nothing to do with units, but it's more to do with battles. And this was again back in the day a major change, and nowadays not so much. This was because back in the day we didn't have the Gold Expedition, we didn't have daily missions. I believe that also offered this feature for you, or it was this feature that you had to deal with, which is double waved attacks or double waved battles. Essentially, now the enemy has two armies um, defending the territory separately. So you'll have to fight one first, and then you have to use the same army that you started with to defeat the second army, or the second wave, essentially. And this is now going to be present in pretty much every province from the postmodern era all the way to the space ages, and this was definitely a big challenge to deal with. Nowadays, once more, the Gold Expedition and your daily missions introduce you to this feature way earlier, and you will definitely find easier ways to deal with that. As for the great buildings, uh, you obviously have the habitat, and I used to have this one in my city, but it's actually a big waste. Yes, it does offer you population, but the innovation tower will definitely not only fix your problem with population, but offer you forge points, and of course, event buildings today just end up offering you thousands upon thousands of people. Every time a new event comes, your population just seems to increase by thousands, at least in my city, and I'm not a diamond player, I'm not a hugely advanced player, so I definitely think that the habitat is not worth it because of that. As for Cape Canaveral, yes, it does produce force points, but I don't advise you to build it straight away. Just wait a little bit until your arc gets a little higher, to level 80 or more if you can, and also your chateau, maybe your Alcatraz. Build the cape later, definitely once you're past, say, future era. And finally, onto the contemporary era, and this is where things again, once more, I'm sorry, but they change once more. This situation, it is the units that change. So as you can see, you have your standard province map or campaign map, whatever you want to call it. Uh, for some reason, the design of the website is different, um, but I'm just going to focus on the grid buildings first. Here you have a Lotus Temple Innovation Tower. Lotus Temple is a complete waste, as you can see down here. I think it offers you like happiness and coins. Yes, it does. And as for the Innovation Tower, it offers you not only population, but forge points, so you should definitely go for that. As for the units themselves, I have a list right here. And from this moment onwards, the large majority of units are going to have these skills over here. As you can see, um, essentially this is going to specialize every unit in a certain way of attack, and it's obviously going to make one or two units per age stand out above the rest. It's something that wasn't that common back in the day. Maybe champions were good, which by the way also means that champions are not really that valuable. They're not worth it anymore if you have them. By the time you reach contemporary era, I don't recommend you to use them. I've seen some people claim that they were good, but not really the chivalry hour and Call of Duty. These skills have been present with them from the first stage, but they are not really worth it in comparison to the ones you see over here in the other units. For example, the flying for attack helicopter. If you see too many infantry units, you can just use it to defeat them, even if they're units from higher ages, which is amazing. This means that you can get a huge amount of battle points that you fought against units from higher ages into your PvP tower of the contemporary era. As for the assault tank, that was one of my favorites. It has reactive armor, means that it can only use, I think it was like 4 points of health, regardless. of the attack of the enemy, which meant that it would always take 3 strikes or more to defeat your assault tank. Yes, they are a bit naked, so to speak, but they have a good defense. And as for the anti-aircraft vehicle, that was that was a gem of the contemporary era. It was one of the best. I didn't use it that much, although I should. I believe this is because they have contact, which basically means that they will retaliate against any enemy attack, and because they have a large range, as you can see over here, I don't think it's 10, I believe it was like 8 hexagons. Anyway, because it has a large range, it can pretty much retaliate against any enemy attack, and this results in much larger damage to the enemy team than you would expect. As for the missile artillery, it's actually very bad as a unit. It only fires once, and it just chooses randomly the splash radius of the shell that it fires. So, how can I put this? This only really works if you're already way too powerful for the enemy team and you're just looking to, have some fun with it. It's really the only reason why it's there is for it to be kind of a meme, for it to be fun, but it's not effective at all, at least from my perspective. Finally, the strike team, it's dropped randomly. There were a few units with this skill in previous eras. I just didn't cover it. I didn't thought it was worth it. This one essentially it's dropped in a random point on the map, which means that it will also have the first strike, I believe, or if it doesn't, it's already close enough that it will most likely strike the enemy team first before it strikes them. And it has stealth. However, I believe it was stealth in like either these bunkers or forests, which are definitely not the most abundant hexagons or places of the battlefield. And so that was my review for the ages in Forge of Empires. As you can see, I'm talking about the ages from the colonial age all the way up to the contemporary era. And in the next and final video, I'll be covering the ages from the tomorrow era all the way up to space age asteroid belt.